The office was silent, the kind of eerie quiet that comes when the rest of the building has emptied for the night. Emily sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she typed out a draft for the following day's meeting. She was used to staying late. Her boss, Paul Kingston, often found excuses to keep her behind. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. "Emily, can I see you in my office for a minute?" Paul's voice carried from across the room, casual yet expectant. It wasn't a question. She hesitated, her stomach tightening as she saved her work and rose to her feet. "Sure, Mr. Kingston," she said, keeping her voice neutral. When she stepped into his office, he closed the door behind her, a move that sent a shiver down her spine. He motioned to the chair in front of his desk, but instead of sitting behind it, he leaned against the edge, far too close for her comfort. "You've been doing excellent work lately," he began, his voice low, his smile just a little too familiar. "I've noticed how much effort you've been putting in." "Thank you," Emily replied cautiously, her eyes flicking to the door. Something about his tone made her uneasy. Paul reached out, his hand brushing her shoulder. The touch lingered, heavy and unwelcome, as he leaned closer. "You're an asset to this team, Emily. Someone like you could go far if you have the right support." Her pulse quickened as his hand moved down her arm, his fingers gripping her wrist. Emily froze, her mind racing. A part of her screamed to pull away, to run, but the weight of fear and shock held her in place. "This isn't appropriate," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul smirked, his grip tightening, hands moving down her body, his eyes gleaming with a sense of victory. Emily's heart was beating like never before. She knew she couldn't, but something in her just made her stay silent. Paul, with a soft voice, told her to bend over. She knew she can't, but the fear of losing her job and shock made her obey. After 30 minutes of hell, he finally stopped letting her go. He left her standing there, shaken and furious. As she returned to her desk, her hands trembling, a single thought cut through the haze. This would never happen again. She wouldn't let him get away with it. In that moment, Emily made a decision. The fear she felt would become her fuel. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to take him down. The following morning, Emily arrived at the office, her steps slower than usual. The bright overhead lights seemed harsher, the familiar hum of keyboards and ringing phones sharper against her senses. Everything about the place felt wrong. As she sat at her desk, she felt the weight of Paul's smirk from the night before, still pressing on her shoulders. Her mind raced. She wanted to scream, to tell someone, to make sure no one else had to go through what she did. But her thoughts clashed with doubts. What if they don't believe me? What if this ruins my career? She knew Paul had power, not just the authority of his position, but the kind of influence that made people look the other way. Hours passed in a blur as she tried to focus on her work. But every time Paul walked past her desk, her chest tightened, her pulse quickening. She felt trapped. The office that once seemed ordinary, now a cage. The shame and anger churned inside her, threatening to break through the surface. By the time her lunch break arrived, Emily could barely sit still. She grabbed her phone and walked briskly to the park across the street, needing fresh air, needing space. As she sat on a bench, the reality of the previous night overwhelmed her, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she admitted to herself that she couldn't handle this alone. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from her best friend Amanda. "Lunch soon? You okay?" Emily stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Need to talk. It's serious." An hour later, Emily sat across from Amanda in a quiet cafe. The words spilled out of her like a dam breaking. Everything about Paul, his manipulation, his actions, and how helpless she had felt. Amanda listened intently, her eyes narrowing with every detail. "Emily, this isn't your fault," Amanda said firmly, her hand reaching across the table. "You have to tell someone. HR, the police, anyone. He can't get away with this." Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. "What if no one believes me? He's so respected here. And me, I'm just the secretary." Amanda's grip on her hand tightened. "You're not just anything. You're smart, capable, and brave as hell. And you're not alone in this. I'll help you." Emily felt a flicker of strength returning, fueled by Amanda's support. For the first time, she considered the possibility of fighting back, not just for herself, but for anyone else Paul might have hurt. The next day, she made the decision. She couldn't let this fester in silence. Emily walked into HR, her heart pounding, and asked to speak with the director. As she sat in the office recounting the events of that night, her voice wavered but never broke. She didn't sugarcoat or shy away from the truth. She told them everything, no matter how difficult. "I trusted this job," she said, her hands clenched in her lap. "I trusted that I'd be treated with respect. Instead, I've been made to feel powerless, but I refuse to stay silent." The HR director, a middle-aged woman with a thoughtful expression, listened carefully, taking notes. "Thank you for coming forward, Emily. This is serious, and we will investigate immediately." The words gave her some comfort, but Emily knew how these things often went. Investigations could be slow, inconclusive, or even brushed aside. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for justice to come to her. She would make her own. Over the following weeks, Emily worked tirelessly behind the scenes. With Amanda's help, she reached out to a few trusted coworkers, quietly asking if they had noticed anything unusual about Paul or if they had experienced similar behavior. To her shock, 2 of them admitted they had, and one woman even revealed her own encounter with Paul, describing patterns that matched Emily's experience. Determined, Emily documented everything: dates, times, conversations, and any evidence she could gather. She connected with an attorney specializing in workplace harassment, who assured her she had a strong case. "You're brave for coming forward," the attorney said. "But this won't be easy. People like him don't give up their power without a fight." Emily's resolve hardened. She wasn't backing down. The office atmosphere grew tense as word of the investigation spread. Paul, ever the charmer, carried on as though nothing was wrong. He greeted employees with his usual smirk, his confidence seemingly unshaken. But Emily noticed the subtle shifts, how his eyes darted toward her desk more often, how his tone with her became clipped and defensive. One day, Paul cornered her in the break room, his voice low but laced with venom. "I hope you know what you're doing," he hissed. "People like me don't go down easily. You're just painting a target on your back." Emily met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Good," she replied. "It'll make it easier to aim." The confrontation only fueled her determination. With every passing day, more employees began to come forward, sharing their own stories about Paul's inappropriate behavior and abuse of power. Emily realized she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was standing up for all of them. The tension reached a boiling point when HR announced a formal hearing to address the allegations. Paul's demeanor shifted dramatically, his once smug confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Emily, meanwhile, prepared herself for the fight of her life. As she sat outside the conference room on the day of the hearing, waiting to be called in, Amanda appeared beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said. "You're not alone." Emily nodded, her heart racing but her resolve steady. She had been through hell, but she had turned her pain into power. Paul Kingston's reign of intimidation was about to end, and Emily Harper was ready to lead the charge. The day of the hearing marked the turning point Emily had fought so hard to reach. The conference room buzzed with tension as employees filed in, curious whispers rippling through the crowd. At the head of the room sat the HR director and a panel of executives, their faces serious. Paul Kingston, seated across from Emily, looked nothing like the confident man who had once wielded power so effortlessly. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped glare. Emily took a deep breath as she was called to testify. She recounted her experiences with unwavering clarity, her voice steady and filled with conviction. She didn't shy away from the details, ensuring the panel understood the extent of Paul's actions and the toxic culture he had fostered. As she spoke, she felt the weight of months of fear and self-doubt lifting from her shoulders. But the most powerful moment came when other employees stood up to share their own stories. Women who had remained silent for years found the courage to speak, emboldened by Emily's bravery. Their testimonies painted a damning picture of Paul, his pattern of behavior undeniable. The verdict was swift and decisive. Paul was terminated effective immediately, his reputation shattered. The company announced sweeping changes to its policies, committing to creating a safer and more inclusive workplace. Emily's actions had not only exposed a predator, but had sparked a movement within the organization. As she walked out of the building that day, the crisp air filled her lungs, carrying a sense of relief and empowerment. Amanda met her outside, a wide smile on her face. "You did it," she said, pulling Emily into a hug. Emily nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "We all did." She knew the fight wasn't over. There were still systemic issues to address, and she wanted to ensure lasting change. But for the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of peace. She had turned her pain into strength, her silence into a voice that couldn't be ignored. This was her victory, and she knew it was only the beginning of the impact she could make.